Hey, welcome everyone. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center and the director of Public Funds Public Schools, which is a collaboration of Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the SPLC Action Fund. PFPS is a national campaign to ensure that public funds for education are used to support and strengthen public schools and are not diverted to private school vouchers or similar programs. You can visit our website, pfps.org, and sign up on the contacts page for updates. We thank you for joining us today for a very exciting event in the PFPS webinar series. This webinar is The Fiscal Consequences of Private School Vouchers, and it features the authors of a research report of that name, as well as the authors of other important research on the cost of voucher programs, and they will be introduced to you shortly. There will be time for audience Q&A as always. A reminder to submit questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and we'll also record the webinar and post it on our website. It's now my pleasure to introduce the moderator of today's webinar, my colleague, Dr. Danielle Farrie, who is the research director at Education Law Center, and her bio will be dropped in the chat. So thank you for leading today's discussion, Danielle.
Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to moderate this really important webinar on the fiscal consequences of private school vouchers. We have great presentations to get to, so I don't want to take too much time, but I do just want to offer some background information to sort of set the stage for the important research that's going to be discussed today. So we are facing a significant shift in the national conversation around vouchers with a very well-organized legislative push to increase privatization across the country. I used the PFPS bill tracker, which is available online, to look at recent trends, and this is what I found. The number of voucher-related bills doubled between 2020 and 2021 from 190 to over 380. There are already more voucher-related bills in the first 4 months of this year than there were in all of 2019 or 2020. There's not a single state that didn't have some type of voucher bill introduced at some point over the last 4 years. And also there's a startling trend in recent years towards universal voucher programs, those with no eligibility criteria. In 2023, there were already 56 bills that mention universal eligibility, twice as many as in all of 2022. And there were really only a handful of such bills in 2021 and none in the prior 2 years. I think these startling numbers really underscore the importance of being able to track the expansion of vouchers so that the public has a better sense of what the introduction or expansion of these programs mean. Too often, these proposals go through without any real sense of their size and their potential cost, and these bills often rely on shoddy fiscal impact statements that dramatically underestimate their true costs, as I'm sure we'll hear more about later. And once up and running, the details of the programs are often hidden in state budgets and other reports that are difficult for the public to access. And of course, this privatization comes with the backdrop of a public school system that is by and large inadequately and inequitably funded, with politicians citing failing schools as the reason that families need more choice, while at the same time failing themselves to provide the resources that the students and staff need and deserve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists so they can share their important research documenting these trends. I'm going to be brief with the introductions, and you can find more detailed bios in the chat. So up first, we have Dr. Sam Abrams and Steven Koutsavlis, both of Teachers College at Columbia University, to discuss their recent report on the fiscal consequences of private school vouchers. And after that, we'll have Dr. Norín of the Florida Policy Institute and Dr. Mary McKillip from Education Law Center to discuss their work on Florida's recent voucher expansion. So with that, I will turn it over to Sam and Steven.
Thank you, Danielle and Jessica. It's been a privilege for Steve and me to work on this report. In this webinar, Steve and I will address 5 issues. First, the unmistakable pattern of steady growth in voucher programs in state after state, rendered by the steady erosion of eligibility requirements for schools as well as students to participate in these programs. Second, the unmistakable combination in state after state of such growth and declining funding for public schools. Third, the blunt fiscal consequences of this migration of funding from public to private schools. Fourth, as Antonio said in Shakespeare's Tempest, what's past is prologue. And this report, which covers data from fiscal 2008 to 2019, is indeed a mild prologue to what is already happening and appears destined to happen. Public education in the United States has been hit by a true tempest And as we'll explain, we can expect this storm to get worse. Danielle already indicated that. Finally, we'll provide some thoughts about the way forward. Steve will address the first two issues. I'll address the latter three. Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Sam. So one of the major findings of our work that we wanted to share with you is an unmistakable pattern of states lifting eligibility requirements to participate in voucher programs, and thus opening these programs up to a much broader swath of the population. Take Milwaukee, for example, as a case in point. Vouchers were introduced in Wisconsin's most populous city in 1990 through a small pilot program that allowed only 1% of the students in the district to participate. The program was also limited to families whose income did not exceed 175% of the federal poverty threshold. And participants can only attend non-sectarian, non-religious private schools. Then in 1995, the program bumped up the cap to 15% of the district's enrollment, while also lifting the ceiling on family income to 220% of the federal poverty level. In 98, the program then dropped the non-sectarian requirement altogether and permitted students to now use vouchers for religious schools. Fast forward to 2011, and we see officials nullified the participation cap entirely, while elevating the ceiling on family income to 300% of the federal poverty threshold. So we see a much higher number of students participating in this voucher program and more well-to-do students receiving these subsidies as well, not just in Milwaukee, but in a number of states under our analysis. In fact, as of 2018, roughly 28% of Milwaukee's 104,000 students use vouchers to attend private schools. And when you take into account that an additional 23% of the district students attend charters, you're left with less than half of the students in the city of Milwaukee now attending traditional district schools, which is just a remarkable turn of events. And we see this trend in state after state. Programs start off very small, and then over the years start to mushroom in both scale and scope. Sort of like the camel getting its nose under the tent, so to speak. This brings me to my second main point. One of the most salient findings in our report is an unmistakable pattern in the direction of funding for vouchers versus traditional district schools. We document that several states substantially ramped up funding for vouchers while concurrently slashing appropriations for public schools. By looking at voucher spending versus per pupil expenditure levels in these case study states, we found that financing for voucher programs climbed sharply in all of the states under our analysis. Over the same time period, we also saw these states systematically reduce the amount of funding going to regular public schools. Let me give some specific examples. Florida leads the pack in terms of voucher spending and showed a considerable increase in the amount of money diverted from state coffers into voucher programs. From fiscal 2008 to 2019, Florida increased spending on vouchers in inflation-adjusted dollars by a whopping 313%, more than tripling their amount of voucher spending. While over the same time period, they decreased school spending by over 12%. This decline in per pupil funding for Florida cannot be attributed to economic duress, since it coincided with the 3.4% growth rate in GDP during these years. And this exceeds the national 3.1% average annual growth rate for the 49 other comparative states. So this means that while Florida outperformed the typical state economy, the state simultaneously slashed funding for traditional district schools, all while ramping up funding for vouchers. And in fact, most recent data now shows that Florida is spending over $1.2 billion annually on vouchers, education savings accounts, and tax credit scholarships. In Arizona, we saw a similar trend. From fiscal 2008 through 2019, Arizona jacked up spending on school vouchers in inflation-adjusted dollars by 270%, while over the same time period decreasing per pupil expenditures for public school students by 5.7%. In Georgia, spending on vouchers during this time went up an astonishing 883%, while the state reduced public school funding by about 2% over these years. Again, economic duress played no role. This decline in funding in Georgia coincided with a 3.7 growth rate in GDP, exceeding the 3.1 mean annual growth rate for the 49 other states. And we observe this trend in state after state after state across our analysis. There were 7 states that we looked at. It's not just the raw amount of money going into voucher programs, but what we want to emphasize here is the really exponential growth trajectory of some of these funding states. And all of this is occurring in places that are giving regular public schools, traditional district schools, the short shrift. I'll now turn things back over to Professor Abrams to share some additional findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. The third issue to address, as I noted, is the blunt fiscal consequences of this migration of funding from public to private schools. While advocates of vouchers as well as charter schools contend that the money follows the students and accordingly does not affect per pupil spending in public schools, such advocates ignore the difference between fixed and variable costs. That terminology, I realize, may invoke nightmares for some of us about classes in microeconomics, about cost curves with fixed costs, variable costs, and average total costs. It's a cause for real mental indigestion for lots of people, if not nightmares. My apologies for that, but this gets to the heart of the matter of the fiscal consequences of these private school vouchers. The sizable presence of fixed costs necessary to run a school district means significant cuts to variable costs when enrollment declines. And enrollment declines when you have students exiting public schools with vouchers to attend private schools. Such variable costs come in the form of teachers, nurses, librarians, and social workers, as well as microscopes, band instruments, art supplies, and computers. Helen Ladd and John Singleton documented precisely this problem in studying the impact of the growth in charter schools in North Carolina, as did Gordon Lafer, studying this phenomenon in Oakland, San Diego, and Santa Clara County. We've got the same thing from other scholars in addressing this issue in Albany and Buffalo. Fourth, as I said, with reference to Antonio's observation in Shakespeare's Tempest, what's past his prologue? Again, Steve and I covered data from fiscal 2008 to 2019 and documented a dramatic increase in voucher programs in 7 states. Yet, since 2019, these programs have grown at an even steeper rate. Moreover, several states, including 2 we studied, Arizona and Florida, have introduced universal voucher programs with no restrictions on eligibility for students and nearly no restrictions on eligibility for schools to participate in these programs. West Virginia authorized such a universal voucher program in 2021, allowing all families regardless of income to participate. Arizona followed suit in 2022. Already in 2023, Iowa, Utah, Florida, and Arkansas have authorized similar universal voucher programs. The House and Senate in North Dakota just endorsed such a voucher program and are currently negotiating how much money to allocate it to it. The House wants $24 million a year, the Senate $10 million a year. Finally, regarding the way forward, I think we have to focus on messaging. And in this light, I think it's helpful to look at the messaging from the other side. I believe it's fair to say that we can trace that messaging from the other side back to the legendary Memorandum in Defense of Free Enterprise authored by Lewis Powell, a year before he joined the Supreme Court as an Associate Justice in 1972. Many of you probably know that Lewis Powell wrote the majority opinion in one of the worst decisions of the 20th century, San Antonio versus Rodriguez, that nullified a petition for equal funding for students in schools. Powell contended in that memorandum that the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and like-minded organizations must join forces in a coordinated, well-financed effort to counter criticism of free market principles. It is indeed telling that Hedrick Smith opened his book, Who Stole the American Dream, published in 2012, with an account of the impact of this memorandum. Hedrick Smith was a great reporter for the New York Times. In 1973, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, as we typically refer to it, and the Heritage Foundation were founded as allies to this end, defined by Lewis Powell. In 1977, Cato Institute emerged as another ally. In 1996 came the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, which changed its name to EdChoice 2 decades later. These organizations have together beat the drum for vouchers. EdChoice alone spends nearly $7 million a year publishing reports promoting the fiscal as well as pedagogical virtues of vouchers. Public funds, public schools is clearly fighting back with reports like this one. The National Education Policy Center, the Network for Public Education, and Education Law Center do similar work, as does the National Education Association and American Federation of Teachers. I'll close in saying we have to do an even better job. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll just remind the participants that we are holding Q&A until after both presentations, but if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box through Zoom. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over to Norín and Mary.
Thank you, Danielle. I am going to try to share my screen here. I have a few slides that wanted to, let's see if I can do this. That's the one. So I'm Mary McKillip. I'm a senior researcher at Education Law Center, and I've been working with Norín this year at the Florida Policy Institute on looking at Florida's current situation with their vouchers, and we've been dealing with the recent legislation that passed just recently. So I think the presentation Sam and Steven did on their work, they looked at the Florida leading up to the time period Norín and I looked at. And so now I'm just going to focus on the past 4 years in Florida from the 2019 school year on. So just to give a little context for Florida, the Education Law Center releases an annual National Making the Grade report. The latest version from 2022 ranks Florida at the bottom on its measure of funding level for public schools, with Florida school districts receiving nearly $4,000 less per pupil in funding compared to the national average in public school funding. And that's after adjusting for regional variations and labor market costs. So in contrast with this low funding of public schools, Florida ranks at the top, and move this guy out of the way. Okay. Florida ranks at the top in the public funding that's being sent to private education, which increased from $832 million in the 2016-17 year to nearly $2 billion in the current school year. This is due to the recent expansions in the past few years of the Family Empowerment Scholarship, or FES. The expansion has allowed higher income families to access the scholarship and no longer requiring past public school participation. The FES alone in this current school year has pulled $1.4 billion from public school district funds to private schools. The report that this chart is based on is the research report that Norín and I put together. It's called Florida's Hidden Voucher Expansion, and it can be found at the link below or on the Florida Policy Institute's website. So to go a little deeper into this FES, or Florida Empowerment Scholarships, these are funded through the Florida Education Finance Program, FEFP, which is the state's school funding formula. This funding formula uses the school district student enrollment numbers from the prior year to determine how much funding goes to each school district annually. The school formula funding amount includes both state aid as well as local funding that the local community is expected to contribute to their districts. Tax credit scholarship vouchers, the other voucher programs still in place, are funded differently through state tax credits that reduce overall state revenue, but don't directly impact school district budgets in the same way as these FES vouchers. So after the district's funds are calculated using the school funding formula, state aid is removed for every student using an FES voucher for that school year. And the funding is taken from the school district state aid amount. So the $1.1 billion in voucher funds that came from public school budgets in 2021-22 in Florida followed a little over 124,000 students. This works out to $8,515 per pupil in state aid taken from public school budgets and rerouted to private education. In comparison, $4,175 per pupil in state aid was directed to public schools that year, combined with $3,648 per pupil in local aid to school districts, totaling $7,823 per pupil in funding for the public school students. So just to summarize this, the current state of vouchers, the amount of public Florida funds being spent on private education has grown dramatically in the past 4 years. In the current school year, total state cost for private vouchers is nearly $2 billion, $1.4 billion being redirected from public schools to private education, which represents 8% of the total state K-12 education funds, and $500 million more from general revenue that would otherwise be used to support state services, including educational expenses as a result of the tax credit vouchers. So given this current context, Norin's now going to talk about the latest legislation that is taking Florida voucher expansion into hyperdrive for the upcoming school year.
Whenever you're ready. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what kinds of vouchers we have here in Florida. We have 3 different kinds. We have what are called traditional private school vouchers and the family empowerment scholarships that Mary talked about. These are funds that are paid directly to private schools for tuition and fees. And currently, families whose incomes are up to 400% of the federal poverty level, or $120,000 for a family of 4, are eligible. So even today, we have a pretty generous allowance for or eligibility for families to take part in vouchers if they choose. We have family empowerment scholarships for students with unique abilities. Those are students with disabilities, and the mechanism to pay for approved educational funds are called education savings accounts. So, families can spend these funds in any approved method. So, tuition and fees could be part of that, but it could be therapeutic supports that a student might need to become, to be academically successful. For students with disability, there are no income limits currently. And the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship, like the FESEO, the Family Empowerment Scholarships, the eligibility is the same. And these payments are made directly to private schools, but it's still a loss of revenue in that these funds never make it to the general fund, so that or any other governmental purpose that they might be used. Whereas the 2 family empowerment scholarships, those funds are coming directly from states' general revenue spending on public education, as Mary said. Next slide, please. So here's a comparison between what our current situation is and where we're going effective July 1. The governor signed it. So HB 1 is law, and we have universal vouchers. We will on July 1st. For the Family Empowerment Scholarship for educational options, like I said, those are our students whose families have incomes up to $120,000 a year for a family of 4. And there's currently a growth cap of 1% of the student population. So the entire statewide population can be, so the number of vouchers can increase by that 1% of all of those students. And we have nearly 3 million students in Florida. And now with HB1, all Florida residents, including millionaires and billionaires, are eligible to attend public schools. Regardless of income, there are no numeric caps either. They are currently, as I said, traditional private school vouchers paid directly to schools, private schools with a parents countersign. But these will become educational savings accounts in 23-24. There's some minimal guardrails that this HB1 stipulates that funds have to be spent on tuition and fees first. But if there are leftover funds, then they can be spent on approved educational uses. And whereas we do not currently allow vouchers for homeschool students, we, beginning July 1, homeschool students will be allowed to take advantage of these vouchers. For students with disabilities, the second category, there never were any income limits. That hasn't changed, but they have increased the numeric growth cap, which ostensibly part of the reason the speaker was so insistent on passing that, on putting out HB1, was to address, thank you, was to address a wait list among students with disabilities. So not a lot of changes there. Homeschool students are allowed. For the Florida tax credit, those operate the same as the family empowerment scholarships in terms of eligibility, and they will also become ESAs. And they'll be offered to homeschool students. Next slide, please. These are the differences in the estimates, and they were there were substantial differences, and I can chat more about that if people have specific questions in the Q&A portion of this, or if you want to just contact me directly another time. I'm happy to talk more about this. Next slide, please. So why does it matter? Because what we anticipate will happen based on experience of Arizona is that the newly eligible homeschool and private school students, they're not currently in public schools, so funds cannot follow them out of public schools to private schools. So essentially, we're increasing the responsibility of the public school system without providing additional funding and support. As Mary said, we are already spending $1.4 billion on public school dollars going to private schools. This is a substantial proportion. Right now, it's like 1 in 10 general education, general revenue public education dollars. From a civil rights perspective, there are no federal protections to students in private schools. They do not have the due process protections that are available to students with disabilities. And like I said, this is a substantial growth in the responsibility of public schools. And under HB1, if the students receiving vouchers were their own school district, they would be larger than Hillsborough County, Florida, Tampa, Florida, where I live, both in the number of students and the needed budget. And the school district that my son went to, we're the 7th largest school district in the nation. So it's not an insignificant expenditure. And I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Norín. My screen is not allowing me to see. Okay, so thank you very much for our to our presenters. I'm going to start us off with some questions. If everyone wants to pop back up, turn your cameras on so everyone can see you. And so I'm going to start with some questions on my own, and then we'll move over to some audience questions. So my first question is for everyone, and you know, feel free to weigh in, whoever wants to. So my question is, how does the availability and accessibility of fiscal data and enrollment data on vouchers affect our ability to truly understand the current landscape? Anyone? Sam, do you want this? You have your microphone.
I'm eager to hear what Norín and Mary have to say about this. But Steve and I had much more luck with some states. We should have noted the 7 states we covered were Arizona, Florida, Louisiana, Georgia, Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And Steve and I had much more luck getting data from Ohio, Indiana, and Wisconsin than we did from Arizona, Louisiana, and Georgia. Florida wasn't that bad, but we did have trouble in particular with Louisiana and Arizona. It made it very difficult, but we eventually got it. And of course, we wanted to provide as much data as we could to see some kind of historical pattern. So that did take some work, but Louisiana and Arizona were quite tough. Steve, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that basically covers it.
Yeah,
Well,
a lot of emailing.
Go ahead, Norín.
I mean, having these data available, I think are hugely important, not just in these states and states that are considering vouchers as well. The work that is in our report from the Law Center, huge support. Really, well, when it is, I mean, it's reliable, valid, you know, we stand by it. We know that it is good, high quality data. And we know that in Idaho, for example, they just fought down for now a universal voucher that took our methodology and they replicated, and they were able to put out the costs, and they stopped it, at least for now. So having this kind of information is opens up a new conversation in these legislatures, and really is a different perspective, because a lot of them, I don't know who said it, they probably Mary, they put these or maybe Danielle, anyways, they put these bills out there without even honestly bothering to ascribe a cost to them. In Florida, until we said something, they did not have, you know, their fiscal impact was indeterminate. So yeah, I think it's hugely important to have these kind of data available. And thank you also to Arizona to help us with these estimates, because we had real data to point to.
Right. That's, I guess, kind of a follow-up to that question is, you know, is there a role for perhaps the federal government to play in terms of collecting consistent data across states, so that we don't have to sort of go through and, you know, beg and plead individual states to provide the data that we're looking for? And if so, what other information do you think that they should be publishing, or at least states should be making available about voucher programs?
Yeah, if I could just jump in. Yeah, currently there exists nothing on the federal level. So far as I know, there's no statutory federal requirements that require a national collection of this data. So it's really up to researchers and other interested parties of going state to state, contacting the various state agencies and obtaining it. You know, it's not like there's a clearinghouse for it on the federal level. And that's, you know, not just data concerning spending, but also, we don't know very much about who's picking up the vouchers, right? We don't know very much about the demographics of those students, whether it's their family backgrounds or family income levels, things of that nature. We have really very little of that data, and it's somewhat obfuscated in a lot of regards.
Great, thank you. Norín or Mary, do you have anything to add on that point?
I agree with Steven, particularly on the demographics piece. I think that's really important, especially as these programs start to pull away their income requirements and such, that all of a sudden, I know in Florida, there were a lot of news reports saying, oh, but the vouchers are good because they're serving low-income students and it's a diverse group of students, but then that's old data now. And now as the voucher program has expanded and grown and allowed wealthier families to access, we don't know what the demographics are of the student population. And that was a real problem with the Florida report that we did, was we couldn't access that type of information. So even that basic demographics, who is it? Who's attending these programs would be really helpful.
Great, thank you. Norín, I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the sort of differences in the cost estimates that were provided under the new legislation in Florida. So maybe if you could speak a little bit to the process of how those fiscal statements came about, and then how were you able to defend your numbers? What was the public reaction to the differences in those estimates? And did you experience pushback? Any sort of advice for how to handle those situations?
Yes. So our estimate at the Law Center and the Florida Policy Institute was $4 billion, as I think Mary outlined. And one thing that was considerably different about our estimates than the House and the Senate versions, which are still being still an appropriations process, is that they did not account for the costs of current students, which seems like, Dr. Abrams is an economist and I am not, but we have to spend the money on the students that are already there, as well as new students that are expected to take advantage of these voucher programs. So that was a large difference. Another big difference was we calculated a 75% uptake rate amongst private school students who are not currently served in schools, whether it's schools who are enrolled as accepting vouchers and have students taking those vouchers, as well as we do have some schools that do not accept those vouchers, although it was very surprising to me when we looked at those schools the schools that did, and it's the very high-end elite private schools do take these vouchers in many cases, which surprised me. So the uptake rate for that, and the other is the homeschool, the number of students served in homeschool. HB1 caps the number of homeschool students at $20,000 a year. What is not reflected in either the House or the Senate estimates is the fact that our very close reading on this bill on several occasions is that there's no reason that once funds are expended in the tax, and they have to be homeschool students are capped in the Florida tax credit. Once those caps are reached, there's nothing in the legislation that we see anywhere that prohibits those students from then applying for scholarships under the family empowerment scholarships, the ones coming directly from the general revenue. So those are the big differences. The House estimates were very low, and from what we can tell, because it's disguised, those expenditures as they are now, because they are not appropriated in the budget. They're just part of this. There's part of a large scale appropriation for the Florida Education Finance Program, but its funds are taken out of periodically as head counts are taken during the school year and kids move back and forth. So there's no way of easily tracking those expenditures. Whereas the Senate now has a line item of 2.2 billion, which is certainly better than the House version, which would really enable us to see those expenditures much more easily. Both the House and Senate version also do have reserves available, just in case their estimates don't pan out. So that was interesting. But the House the reserves are pretty small in a $30 billion education budget. We were able to, we stood by our estimates again and again, based on that our estimates reflect the full cost. And we were able to add, when I talked to House and Senate staff, they did not disagree that our analyses were accurate. They just did not agree with our assumptions. So, we stand by them now. We were also able to provide data to school districts and people on the local level, so that they could use their data for, very directly reflecting what expenditures are coming out of their school district budgets. So I think I lost the question, Danielle. I hope that addressed.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to switch over to some of the questions from our audience in the Q&A. So the first one is somewhat related to this question we're just tackling. They say that it seems like any ESA or voucher program usually starts small, selling it as programs for low-income students or students with disabilities, but then they tend to balloon into universal programs. So the attendee asks, is it safe to say that no voucher is designed to say limited? And then I guess I would just add to that, how do we sort of balance the need to raise the alarm on these new programs without having to sort of wait to see how big they get, so how do we balance that that sort of tension? Sam, if you want to go first.
Sure, I'll say in this light, it's a great question. The two champions of the first voucher program in Milwaukee in 1990, Howard Fuller and Polly Williams, said years later, after all these caps were lifted, that they were advocating for vouchers to give children from poor families an alternative. They weren't trying to replace the public school system. So Howard Fuller and Polly Williams, themselves advocates of vouchers, came to see that this transmutation of the voucher program in Milwaukee, which, as Steve said at the outset, has been replicated across the country, is not what was supposed to happen, but this is what we should expect. Okay, if you look at all of the reports coming out of the American Legislative Exchange Council, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, EdChoice, this is what they want, and we have to look at this problem with our eyes wide open. This is what they want, and this is what we're getting.
Thank you. Does anyone else have anything they want to add to that?
Yeah, and I agree. And I thought I was the only one to use the camel's nose under the tent analogy, but I've been using that because that's exactly how it started in Florida. It's small. This starts as a pilot. It's only for kids with disabilities. It's only for kids in, schools that are not performing. And then it just grows and grows. So I think any proposal related to a voucher needs to be acted upon immediately.
If I just may jump back in, apropos Milwaukee, one of the best analyses of voucher programs came ironically from the Wall Street Journal. In 2018, Townell Hobbs wrote this article about the voucher program in Milwaukee 30 years later. I mean, it was almost 30 years later. And the Wall Street Journal, of all publications, concluded that if students went from a public school to a private school, where the private school spent no more than the amount allowed by the voucher, students did worse. If they went to a private school that had a cap on the number of students who could use vouchers and spent more money, they did better, which proves money matters and integration matters. So the Wall Street Journal, we need to be reminded of this. It's a great article. I assign it every year in a class I teach on privatization and choice at Teachers College. Conceded that the Milwaukee program has essentially been a bust. And advocates have moved the goalposts. They say, okay, the academic gains that we predicted didn't get achieved, but at least the families have choice now. Okay, so this all has to be very much acknowledged. The Wall Street Journal itself. I'm sure the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, Ed Choice, and ALEC didn't republish the Wall Street Journal article, but you can easily find it. Townell Hobbs, 2018, Milwaukee vouchers. It's a very important article.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to switch us over a little bit. We had a number of questions from the audience around communication and organizing. So I'm wondering if you guys have any tips for messaging and strategies for engaging community members about these programs, how to fight back, really sort of conveying the impact of these voucher programs on the public system. So any sort of tips for the audience members that are looking to organize? Mary, do you want to start, or Norín?
Well, I mean, one thing I would say was the work in Florida was really useful to have Arizona, because they unfortunately were 10 steps ahead of Florida. Florida is quickly catching up. But because they had this universal voucher already in place, that's where we got the 75%, our estimate that's the percent of current private school students who would take advantage of the vouchers for Florida, was using what we were already seeing in Arizona. And the fact that it was already having this impact on state funding, requiring more state funds than anyone in Arizona anticipated, we were able to bring that into the Florida conversation. So I think that is something with organizing locally, is looking at the larger landscape, which this fiscal consequences report, like just accessing these other resources that can point you at what is happening elsewhere, and you can use that as leverage in your own local campaigns.
Yeah, that's a great point. Can you, we did have another question that relates to this. So do you have any suggestions for people who are looking to do cost analyses that don't have existing voucher programs up? So how can they sort of make estimates based on other states? I mean, just maybe a little bit more detail on how you went about that.
So we do have on our website with the Florida report, we do have a step-by-step of how we went through the cost analysis, which is way too complicated for me to get into here, but something with just having enrollment numbers of how many, Florida had district level, how many students in every district were receiving home education, how many students in every district were attending private school already. So we could use that data to make our estimates. So having access to just basic enrollment numbers is tremendously useful.
Great. Maybe we can drop a link to that that part of the report in the chat. Does anyone else want to sort of weigh in on this organizing question, this messaging question?
I mean, it's, this is probably like basic organizing tactics, but one thing for us was just, just being brave and stick to your story. That was like hugely important. You're like, are you sure those are the numbers? Yes, we are sure. We are so sure. And let us tell you why. But also, we had in Florida, we were incredibly lucky to have a strong table of very diverse coalition partners that we were able to engage and let them do the things that they're good at. So we had Pastors for Florida's Children, we had the Southern Poverty Law Center, we had family organizations who were able to take the ball and run with it and get their families to call senators and legislators and make their case. Because you know what, the legislators see me come and they roll their eyes, they're like, here's Dollard policy wonk, whatever. It's much more impactful to have the stories as well. So putting the data together with the stories. Yeah, and just like I said, the fact that we were able to talk about costs at all was changed the conversation completely. So having those data and just at all was a game changer, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we're also seeing some good local reporting. Sometimes it helps to have some of these issues brought down, not just from the state or federal level to back like more of the hometown level. We're seeing some good reporting on the local level in response to our reports and some of the other work of the partner organizations here. And sometimes that could be helpful to, sort of build upon or to share with stakeholders. Some journalists are receptive also to being contacted, in terms of looking for other allies, other ways to sort of continue to amplify this message.
Yeah, for sure. And identifying those education reporters in your state do press releases and press conferences for sure. But if there are particular reporters, which there undoubtedly are, find them and connect to them.
Great, thank you. Sort of another related issue around perhaps unexpected allies in this fight. One of the participants mentioned that the recent voucher proposal in Georgia was largely pushed back because of opposition from rural communities. So maybe Sam or Steven, if you want to sort of comment on how how we can make a greater point that the vouchers may people may think that they only are going to affect the urban communities or whatever. How do we make the larger point that the vouchers have a widespread impact?
Well, this is really a new development because of the education savings account, which can be used really as a debit card, and in fact functions as a debit card in some cases. Up until very recently, charter schools, I would say it's still the case. Charter schools and private schools have not presented much of a threat to rural schools for the simple economic reason that they can't achieve economies of scale in sparsely populated areas. They can't fill the seats, okay, because they're so sparsely populated. But with these education savings accounts, okay, that we talked about in West Virginia, Arizona, Iowa, Utah, Florida, Arkansas, it's coming in North Dakota. That's a game changer because parents can now withdraw their children in Iowa, for example, get an $8,000 debit card, okay, from that rural school and buy online curricula, get tutoring, whether it's online or in person, pay for ballet lessons, piano lessons, and the like. And when you have an exodus of students from already small schools, very small schools in rural areas, it can be the case that those schools will fold. We already have a significant amount of consolidation of rural schools across rural, of schools in small towns in rural states, okay? And it's a big problem. I remember the longtime mayor of Woodbine, Iowa, small town near the Missouri River of 1,400 people, told me when he was worried about consolidation of schools in his area, that if you lose your school, you lose your town. And we have to remember, and this is a message that we have to convey, that schools, of course, function as something much more than just academic institutions alone. They're civic hubs for the fall musical and the spring drama and concerts and athletic competitions. So I think a message that has to be conveyed is that these ESAs, these education savings accounts, now really do, in states like Georgia, as well as Iowa and Utah, pose a significant threat to not just rural schools, but rural life.
That's a great point. Thank you.
I just to quickly add that what happened in Georgia was fantastic, and I definitely think that we do need to get a better grasp on how they did what they did, because that was great to see. Whereas in Florida, there was just no stopping the legislature, and I wish we could have figured out a way.
In Texas, there was an article recently in the New York Times about pushback in Texas against vouchers. And it was just this argument that was being made in Texas, that if you see an exodus of students from your school, then life in those communities will be dramatically altered, and they don't want it. This is a very conservative state. And that's a state that should be turned to for a template of how to fight this battle, ironically.
Oh, yes, and I'm seeing in the chat, Idaho too. Good job to Idaho.
So I guess along those lines, this is another question from the audience. What key policy areas should lawmakers consider when they're evaluating these voucher related bills? And, perhaps, some tactics that maybe allies could be able, to use to convince their fellow legislators that this is not the right move. What are the key areas that you think that they should be thinking about when these proposals start to come through states?
Yeah, something we haven't really spoken too much about today is sort of considerations for special needs students. Are students, going to be receiving the required special education services that they may need when they're pulled out of the public school system and sort of put into private schools? Many private schools don't have, dedicated faculty to special education. They may not require certain certifications. So there's, considerations there for families with, students with special needs, if those needs are going to be adequately addressed. And if they're not, I think that is a very concerning, public policy issue.
And in the same vein, thinking about our kids who are LGBTQ, our trans students, students who, wear a hijab. I mean, private schools are not required to, they don't have to take everyone, and they don't have to keep everyone. And so looking at all of our marginalized students to begin with is huge, as Steven says. So I would definitely bring that up for sure, and engage, the disability community in conversations.
And engage the science community, because just as these schools can bar members of the LGBTQ community from enrollment as well as employment, they can teach creationism in biology classes. So scientists need to speak up, and their voices must be heard. They can't be quiet about this.
Great, thank you so much. I should have mentioned that was time for us. That was the last question that we had time for. I see Jessica popped back up, but I just want to take a second to thank all of our panelists and the audience, and also PFPS for hosting this webinar. And I will turn it over to Jessica for some closing remarks.
Well, thank you so much for that fantastic discussion. I know we can never get to all the great questions from the audience, but we will try to reach out to those whose questions weren't answered. And we also encourage you to contact Public Funds Public Schools at info@pfps.org, and we'll respond to your emails with resources and help make connections to advocates in your region, or if you have a specific question that we can forward to our panelists from today. There were also many questions about messaging and advocacy tools, so we encourage you to look at PFPS's website's advocacy page for 2-page fact sheets with talking points on specific topics that have been asked about here, and other webinars about advocacy against voucher legislation and tips from more great speakers. So I want to thank ELC's Nicole Chulo, Wendy Lecker, and Sharon Krangle for helping with this event behind the scenes, our moderator, Dr. Danielle Farrie, and of course, our wonderful panelists. You can find the report and analysis of Florida's voucher programs by Dr. Mary McKillip and Dr. Norín Dollard on the websites of Education Law Center and the Florida Policy Institute. And if you haven't yet, make sure to check out the full report by Dr. Samuel Abrams and Steven Koutsavlis from Teachers College, Columbia, called The Fiscal Consequences of Private School Vouchers, that was recently released by PFPS. It was our honor to release that report, and it's available on the research page of the PFPS website. And we'll also send out those links with the webinar recording. But finally, thank you to our audience for joining us today for this event in the Public Funds Public Schools webinar series. We look forward to seeing you at a future event. Thank you all so much.